Good morning, grade 7s. In today's e-learning lesson, we are going to be learning about the transatlantic slave trade. This marks the beginning of our Term 2 History. Please find the e-learning divider in the History section of your notebooks. Not geography, guys, history. Write the date on a clean page and let us begin. Please do keep in mind that this video will be for listening to explanations only, and all your notes that you need to write in your notebooks will be sent separately. I will be covering all work in your textbooks, so please follow with me from page 128 until 132. However, if you prefer to listen before looking at your books, that is okay too. Let us begin. From 1451 until 1870, about 12 million Africans from West Africa were taken to America as slaves. This trade in slaves is referred to as the transatlantic slave trade. People were captured in West Africa and were transported as slaves across the Atlantic Ocean. They were sold at auctions and were made to work on plantations in America. The raw materials produced on the plantations, like sugar, rice, cotton, and tobacco, were shipped to factories in Europe. Manufactured goods were then sold in Europe and in West Africa. If you take a look at source A on page 128, you can see slaves on board a ship crossing the Atlantic Ocean. As you can see from the picture, it was very overcrowded, which means very unsanitary. A lot of slaves died during this journey because of the conditions that they were forced under. Let's talk about slavery in West Africa and West African farmers. Most West Africans lived in settled farming societies. Farmers grew food to feed themselves and their families. If there was food left over, they traded it for other goods that they needed. Farming and herding livestock required a lot of people to do the work. Even if a community was settled on good land with good water supplies, they still needed people to farm the land. Farmers who needed extra workers would sometimes exchange some of their grain for a child from a poor family. This child would then work for the family who bought him or her. Often, people who were very poor voluntarily became slaves in exchange for food and shelter. When people think of slavery today, they usually think of slavery from long ago in the United States, where black slaves from West Africa were owned by white masters. Can we just stop and picture how terrible the living conditions of these people were in order for them to voluntarily become slaves and work for other people, and to be treated in a cruel way just to get food and shelter, as well as children being sold to families just because they do not have any source of income or a place to stay. This is terrible conditions, and I want you to keep this in mind. So what was slavery like in West Africa? The kind of slavery in West Africa was different to the kind of slavery that developed as a result of the European transatlantic slave trade. In West Africa, slavery was only practiced on a small scale. These slaves were usually people who were captured in battle, were criminals, had been chased away by other local societies, were bought to perform unskilled work or domestic labor, or might become part of the families of slave owners, or later become soldiers. The Trans-Sahara slave trade. Indigenous West African slavery changed at the beginning of the 7th century, when thousands of black slaves were sent to North Africa, parts of the Middle East, and Southern Europe. Later, African kings like Mansa Musa, who you should remember from the previous term, raided their weaker neighbors and sold their captives as slaves. They also kept slaves of their own. These men were powerful rulers with large armies, and slaves were often used as soldiers. Slaves worked in the gold mines and farmed the land. They were usually exchanged for horses. 15 or 20 slaves were exchanged for one Arabian horse, which means that slaves were not worth very much in those times. If one horse can equal 15 or 20 slaves, it just shows the lack of humanity that took place in that time. And that concludes the first unit of the transatlantic slave trade. Thank you so much, grade 7s, for your time, and good luck and happy learning. Bye!